Sometimes the moment your life changes doesn't look like a moment at all. It's a small decision that feels harmless at the time. You stop explaining yourself. You stop correcting people. You stop reacting. You stop reaching first. You stop trying to be understood by those who never really listened. And you tell yourself it's temporary. You say, I just need space. I just need time. I just need to breathe. But something deeper is happening. Distance doesn't begin as separation. It begins as awareness, not anger, not hatred, not resentment, clarity. You start noticing how tired you feel after certain conversations, how your body tightens around certain people, how you become smaller in certain spaces, how some connections feel like labor instead of rest. And slowly, without making it a rule, without making it a philosophy, without announcing it to anyone, you begin to move differently. You reply slower. You share less. You observe more. You protect your energy without calling it protection. From the outside, nothing looks different, but internally, everything is shifting. This is where most people misunderstand distance. They think it's punishment. They think it's ego. They think it's pride. They think it's arrogance. They think it's coldness. But real distance doesn't come from superiority. It comes from self-preservation. Not the loud kind. Not the defensive kind. Not the bitter kind. The quiet kind. The kind that grows when you finally understand that not everyone deserves access to your inner world. That not every relationship is meant to last. That not every bond is meant to deepen. That not every connection is meant to be carried forward into the future. Some people are meant to meet you, not stay with you. Some people are meant to walk beside you for a season, not a lifetime. And some people are meant to show you exactly what you no longer want to become. Distance begins when you stop forcing alignment where there is none. When you stop shrinking yourself to keep proximity. When you stop bending your values to maintain connection. When you stop tolerating emotional confusion in the name of loyalty. At first, it feels uncomfortable. You feel guilty. You feel selfish. You feel like you're doing something wrong. You feel like you're becoming too much, or too distant, or too different. Because you were trained to believe that closeness equals goodness. That accessibility equals kindness. That availability equals love. That endurance equals loyalty. That tolerance equals maturity. But endurance isn't always strength. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's attachment. Sometimes it's habit. Sometimes it's the fear of being alone. Sometimes it's the fear of disappointing others. Sometimes it's the fear of being misunderstood. Distance doesn't always mean disconnection. Sometimes it means alignment. Sometimes it means you are finally listening to your nervous system. Sometimes it means you are respecting your limits. Sometimes it means you are honoring your inner boundaries. Sometimes it means you are choosing peace over performance. Because the truth is, your body knows before your mind does. It knows when a place isn't safe. It knows when a person isn't consistent. It knows when a dynamic isn't healthy. It knows when something is draining you slowly. You feel it as exhaustion, as heaviness, as irritability, as numbness, as disinterest, as emotional fatigue. But most people ignore these signals. They call it stress. They call it life. They call it responsibility. They call it being adult. They call it being strong. Until one day, they don't want to speak anymore. Not because they're angry, but because they're empty. And that's when distance begins to feel natural. Not forced, not dramatic, not symbolic. Natural. You stop explaining yourself to people who don't try to understand you. You stop proving yourself to people who already made their judgments. You stop overgiving to people who don't reciprocate. You stop pouring into spaces that don't pour back. And something strange happens. Your silence becomes louder than your words ever were. People notice, not because you announce your absence, but because your energy is no longer available. Your reactions disappear. Your emotional labor disappears. Your constant presence disappears. Your availability disappears. And this is where the real shift begins. Because distance changes power dynamics. Not in a manipulative way. Not in a controlling way. In a psychological way. When you stop chasing connection, people start noticing your absence. When you stop over-explaining, people start questioning their assumptions. When you stop trying to be understood, people feel the loss of access. When you stop reacting, people lose influence. Not because you are trying to gain control, but because you removed dependency. You are no longer emotionally feeding the dynamic. And many relationships survive not on mutual respect, but on emotional access. Access to your attention. Access to your reactions. Access to your validation. Access to your availability. Access to your emotional energy. When that access disappears, the structure of the relationship changes. Some people become curious. Some become confused. Some become distant. Some become reactive. Some become angry. Some become nostalgic. Some become silent. Because distance forces reflection. It removes noise. It removes stimulation. It removes distraction. It removes emotional clutter. And in that silence, people are left with themselves, with their thoughts, with their patterns, with their behaviors, with their unresolved emotions, with their projections. This is why distance feels uncomfortable for others. Not because you changed, but because the mirror is gone. They no longer get feedback from your presence. They no longer get emotional reinforcement. They no longer get validation loops. They no longer get response cycles. They are alone with themselves, and that creates discomfort. Distance also changes you. You start hearing your own thoughts more clearly. You start noticing what you actually want. You start feeling your own emotional rhythms. You start recognizing your patterns. You start understanding your triggers. You start seeing your attachments. You start recognizing where you compromise yourself. You become more honest internally, not because you're trying to grow, but because silence creates clarity. When there's less noise, truth becomes louder. You realize how much of your personality was adaptation, how much of your behavior was survival, how much of your identity was performance, how much of your kindness was fear-based, how much of your loyalty was attachment, how much of your patience was avoidance. And none of this feels dramatic. It feels quiet. It feels subtle. It feels internal. It feels personal. It feels private. You're not trying to change the world. You're trying to regulate your inner world. Distance makes you more selective. Not cold. Not distant. Not closed. Selective. You begin to value depth over familiarity, safety over history, consistency over intensity, clarity over chaos, peace over excitement, and your nervous system relaxes. Not because life becomes easier, but because it becomes quieter. Your emotions stabilize. Your reactions slow down. Your thoughts become clearer. Your energy becomes more contained. Your boundaries become more natural. You stop explaining your boundaries. You just live them. You stop justifying your needs. You just honor them. You stop negotiating your values. You just embody them. And this is where everything truly changes. Not externally, internally. Your standards shift. Your tolerance changes. Your patience becomes intentional. Your time becomes sacred. Your attention becomes focused. You stop seeing distance as loss and start seeing it as alignment. Because not everything that leaves is a loss, and not everything that stays is a blessing. Some exits are protection. Some endings are clarity. Some separations are healing. Some silences are medicine. Distance teaches you who you are without external noise. It teaches you how much of you was shaped by others. It teaches you how much of you was shaped by fear. It teaches you how much of you was shaped by survival. It teaches you how much of you was shaped by approval. And slowly, you begin to meet yourself. Not the version that performs. Not the version that adapts. Not the version that pleases. Not the version that survives. The version that exists. The version that doesn't need to prove. The version that doesn't need to chase. The version that doesn't need to impress. The version that doesn't need to convince. The version that doesn't need to explain. Just the version that is. Distance strips away the unnecessary conversations, the unnecessary attachments, the unnecessary expectations, the unnecessary obligations, the unnecessary emotional labor, the unnecessary roles, and you become lighter, not happier in a dramatic way, not euphoric, not constantly peaceful, but stable, grounded, clear, present, aware. You stop craving chaos. You stop romanticizing intensity. You stop confusing attachment with love. You stop confusing familiarity with safety. You stop confusing history with meaning. And you start choosing consciously who gets your time, who gets your energy, who gets your presence, who gets your vulnerability, who gets your inner world. Distance teaches you discernment, not judgment, not superiority, not detachment, discernment. You don't hate people. You don't reject people. You don't devalue people. Not everyone fits your values. Not everyone fits your pace. Not everyone fits your depth. Not everyone fits your emotional language. And that's not wrong. It's reality. Distance doesn't make you lonely. It makes you honest. Honest about your needs. Honest about your limits. Honest about your capacity. Honest about your emotional resources. Honest about your boundaries. Honest about your energy. And when you live from honesty instead of obligation, everything shifts. Your relationships change. Your conversations change. Your priorities change. Your focus changes. Your identity changes. Your self-concept changes. Not because you tried to become someone else, but because you stopped pretending. You stopped pretending you were okay. You stopped pretending you were fine. You stopped pretending you didn't need space. You stopped pretending you didn't feel overwhelmed. You stopped pretending you didn't feel drained. You stopped pretending you didn't feel misaligned. Distance becomes honesty in action. Not words, not explanations, not declarations. Behavior. And behavior is always louder than language. People feel the shift, even if they can't explain it, even if they can't name it. They feel the difference, because your energy is no longer leaking. Your attention is no longer scattered. Your emotions are no longer overextended. Your presence is no longer diluted. You become more contained, more centered, more stable, more grounded, more rooted, more whole. And this is where distance becomes transformation. Not as an act of separation, but as an act of self-integration. You stop living externally. You start living internally. You stop measuring yourself through others. You start measuring yourself through alignment. You stop defining yourself through roles. You start defining yourself through values. You stop organizing your life around reactions. You start organizing your life around meaning. And slowly, quietly, gently, everything begins to change. Not because the world changed, but because you did. You start noticing something else too. Distance doesn't only change how you relate to others. It changes how you relate to yourself. You no longer feel the constant pressure to perform your personality. You don't feel the need to maintain versions of yourself for different people. You don't feel the obligation to manage everyone's emotions. You don't feel responsible for keeping dynamics alive. You feel more internal, more self-contained, more private, more quiet inside. Not empty quiet, not lonely quiet, full quiet. The kind of quiet where your thoughts don't fight each other, where your emotions aren't competing for attention, where your nervous system isn't constantly alert, where your mind isn't rehearsing conversations that haven't happened yet. You start responding instead of reacting, choosing instead of complying, observing instead of absorbing, and slowly, your identity begins to reorganize itself, not through motivation, not through affirmations, not through discipline, not through force, through subtraction. You subtract chaos. You subtract noise. You subtract unnecessary connections. You subtract emotional overload. You subtract constant stimulation. You subtract pressure. And what remains is you. Not a perfected version. Not an ideal version. Not a polished version. A real one. A grounded one. A regulated one. A present one. Distance changes the way you love to. You no longer love from fear. You no longer love from attachment. You no longer love from anxiety. You no longer love from need. You no longer love from loneliness. You love from stability. You don't chase closeness. You don't fear distance. You don't cling to connection. You don't panic at silence. You don't confuse intensity with intimacy. You understand that closeness isn't measured by proximity. It's measured by safety. You understand that connection isn't measured by frequency. It's measured by depth. You understand that love isn't measured by sacrifice. It's measured by mutual regulation. You understand that loyalty isn't endurance. It's alignment. Distance teaches you that real connection feels calm. Not chaotic, not confusing, not exhausting, not overwhelming. Calm, not boring calm, not empty calm, secure calm. The kind of calm where you don't need to guess, where you don't need to overthink, where you don't need to perform, where you don't need to monitor, where you don't need to manage. You just exist, and others exist with you. Not in pressure, not in tension, not in fear, but in ease. Distance also teaches you something difficult. Some people only know how to relate to you when you are accessible, when you are available, when you are responsive, when you are emotionally open, when you are predictable, when you are consistent in giving. When that version of you changes, the relationship changes. Not because you became worse, but because the structure depended on your emotional labor. Some bonds were built on your availability. Some dynamics were built on your patience. Some connections were built on your tolerance. Some relationships were built on your silence. Some attachments were built on your self-sacrifice. When you stop offering those things automatically, the connection restructures or dissolves. And that can hurt, even when it's necessary, even when it's healthy, even when it's right. Because not everything that's unhealthy feels bad, and not everything that's healthy feels comfortable. Growth feels like loss at first, because identity is attached to familiarity. You miss people, not because they were good for you, but because they were familiar. You miss dynamics, not because they were healthy, but because they were known. You miss versions of yourself, not because they were authentic, but because they were practiced. Distance brings grief, quiet grief, private grief, unspoken grief. The grief of letting go of who you were. The grief of releasing old roles. The grief of shedding old identities. The grief of leaving old worlds. But grief is not always about people. Sometimes it's about versions of self. And as that grief moves through you, something else forms. Stability. You stop living in emotional extremes. You stop swinging between closeness and withdrawal. You stop oscillating between attachment and avoidance. You stop moving between chaos and numbness. You settle, not into stagnation, not into isolation, into balance. You begin to feel emotionally regulated. You begin to feel mentally clear. You begin to feel internally consistent. You begin to feel psychologically safe within yourself. And that's when distance stops feeling like separation. It starts feeling like integration. You are no longer fragmented across relationships, no longer scattered across expectations, no longer divided across roles, no longer pulled in multiple directions. You are whole in one place, inside yourself. You stop seeking identity through connection. You stop defining yourself through others. You stop measuring your worth through access. You stop proving your value through giving. You just exist. And from that place, relationships change. You don't attach easily, but you connect deeply. You don't open quickly, but you open honestly. You don't bond through chaos, but through consistency. You don't stay through obligation, but through alignment. You become selective without becoming closed. You become open without becoming exposed. You become kind without becoming self-erasing. You become loving without becoming dependent. Distance creates internal authority, not control over others, not power over people, authority over self. You trust your perceptions. You trust your instincts. You trust your boundaries. You trust your pace. You trust your needs. You trust your limits. You no longer need external permission to protect your peace. And something subtle happens. You stop needing validation. You stop needing approval. You stop needing reassurance. You stop needing confirmation. You stop needing external grounding. Because your grounding is internal. Your safety is internal. Your stability is internal. Your identity is internal. Your clarity is internal. Distance doesn't make you isolated. It makes you independent in the deepest psychological sense. Not independent as in detached. Not independent as in disconnected. Independent as in self-regulated. Whole without needing to be filled. Stable without needing to be held. Grounded without needing to be guided. Clear without needing to be directed. And from that place, you relate differently to the world. You move slower. You choose carefully. You speak intentionally. You act consciously. You engage selectively. Not because you're afraid, but because you're aware. You understand that your attention is currency. Your energy is currency. Your presence is currency. Your emotional availability is currency. And you don't spend it unconsciously anymore. Distance teaches you that not everything deserves a response. Not every emotion deserves expression. Not every thought deserves voice. Not every invitation deserves acceptance. Not every connection deserves access. Silence becomes a skill. Restraint becomes strength. Presence becomes power. Not power over others. Power over self. And the most important change happens quietly. You stop trying to be understood by everyone. You stop trying to be liked by everyone. You stop trying to be accepted by everyone. You stop trying to be chosen by everyone. You start choosing yourself. Not in a selfish way. Not in an isolating way. Not in a superior way. In an aligned way. You become loyal to your nervous system. You become loyal to your peace. You become loyal to your values. You become loyal to your truth. You become loyal to your inner stability. And when you live from that place, your life reorganizes itself. Your relationships become fewer but deeper. Your world becomes smaller but safer. Your circle becomes quieter but stronger. Your life becomes simpler but fuller. Not because you lost people, but because you gained clarity. You don't need chaos to feel alive. You don't need drama to feel connected. You don't need intensity to feel important. You don't need noise to feel seen. You feel alive in stillness. You feel connected in presence. You feel important in alignment. You feel seen in authenticity. Distance teaches you that peace is not emptiness. It's fullness without noise. It's a mind that isn't overcrowded. It's a heart that isn't overwhelmed. It's a nervous system that isn't hypervigilant. It's an identity that isn't fragmented. It's you being with yourself without tension. And that's the real change. Not who left. Not who stayed. Not who noticed. Not who reacted, but who you became when you stopped trying to hold everything together. You became calmer. You became clearer. You became more grounded. You became more honest. You became more whole. Distance didn't remove your world. It refined it. It didn't make you alone. It made you aligned. It didn't disconnect you. It integrated you. And when you look back, you realize something simple. Choosing distance was never about leaving others. It was about finally meeting yourself.